Hello, my name's Andrew Hugill, and this is an interim report to the Percy Grainger Society on the Gloss project consultancy. I am a white male, I have glasses and a fairly full white beard, brown hair. I'm age 66. Today I'm wearing a blue sweatshirt. The brief I was given was first of all to review the current Gloss site, and the address is given on the screen. I'll be sharing these slides after the talk. And then I was asked to identify possible expansions of the site for neurodivergent people. Now, we've agreed that I will focus my attention on autistic people rather than a full range of neurodiversity. Autism is something that I know about. I'm autistic myself and I'm quite expert in it. And other areas of neurodiversity I know something about, but perhaps not as much. But more importantly, I think it's key to identify a clear target group for the site expansion, and autistic people are a good target group for that. This is the Gantt chart that I created for the project. You'll see it runs from April to December. I've divided the work into packages. The first package in April and May was a site review, and I'll be reporting on that in a moment. And then also work package 2, an analysis and development package, which ended in July. Well, we're not quite at the end of July yet, but in fact the work is completed. Then in August I shall be looking at development and recommendations, starting with the creation of some soundscape work of my own as a kind of demonstrator, and then coming up with some summary findings and recommendations. And then in October, we're going to look at outreach and how we communicate this to the potential target audience through partnerships and wider initiatives. And the project will conclude with a final written report and an academic article for the Grainger journal. I am writing blog entries as we go, and the first one is available on my blog. And I'm making an interim report in July, as indicated here, and I have regular meetings with Paul Jackson in particular. So before we start into the review, I should just say a word about compliance. This is a legal requirement now, certainly in the UK and I think around the world, that all design should be accessible to people of all kinds with a range of abilities and disabilities. In terms of the web, this means conforming with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which are currently transitioning from the version 2.2 to version 3. But the version 2.2 is good for the moment. I ran an access scan compliance check on the current site, and the site failed. Now, this is perhaps should be taken with a little bit of a pinch of salt, because these online scans tend to be designed to try and sell you a product. So Access Scan is wanting you to then take out a subscription so they can fix your problems. However, the failures that it identified were nevertheless very important and do demand fixing. So there are things to be learned from that. But in general, I've taken not just the compliance requirements, but also the specific needs of autistic people into account. And I've done that with reference to a number of key studies that are listed on the screen. Probably the most important is the National Autistic Society's Autism Accessibility Guidelines. This is a very extensive survey of large numbers of autistic people and what their preferences are in terms of web design. So the first part of my review concerned accessibility. I looked at a large number of different aspects of the site. There are some recommendations, but generally speaking, the design of the site is pretty good. The page layout is good, but it needs to be a bit more hierarchical because autistic people like to see a clear hierarchy. Likewise, the navigation is generally good, but there is some confusion in the menu items. Colours are calm, which is great, but it would be nice to have some user customization so that users can choose what colour palette they see on the site. You can see a good example of this at the National Autistic Society's own website. Then the fonts, there is a mix of serif and sans serif fonts. That is a problem. You need to be consistent, either one or the other. Generally speaking, sans serif seem to be preferred. And then it can't be customised for the Open Dyslexic font, for example. But the written text is excellent on the site. It would be good to have more videos, and you should caption all videos. But the images are generally fine. There's not too much movement on the site. There is a carousel, which could probably be better static. The language is good, but you do need to explain acronyms that are not always explained. However, there's no customization on the site available, and currently you can't share anything, and that's something I'll come back to. The real issue, I think, on the site is usability. This is when you get down to the actual samples themselves. And the first thing is, these are raw samples. So anything you decide to do with them requires a lot of heavy editing. And I tried to build sample instruments of the piano, the harmonium and so on. It took me 2 days of work in Logic and GarageBand to do that, and it was quite frustrating. The samples, for example, have a period of silence at the beginning of each sample that needs to be edited out in order that when you press a key on a keyboard, it plays instantly. For an instrument like the piano, you really require a range of articulations and dynamics for each individual note and durations of each sample. So really, it was not possible to play Percy's piano convincingly, which was a bit disappointing. And then from a user point of view, it's very unclear what to do with these samples when you reach the site. There's little or no explanation of a compositional approach you might take or processes you could use. There is a video of an example of a piece, which is great, but it's not clear how that was arrived at. From an autistic point of view, unless you're already a very expert user of raw samples, really, it's not very usable. In terms of the instruments, I would make a comparison with Sonic Couture's extended piano or the John Cage prepared piano put out by Big Fish to get an idea of the possibilities. But essentially what I concluded in the written report is that Gloss is not usable by a novice, whether autistic or not. I'm a pretty sophisticated user and I found it quite challenging to work with. Relevance. I identified 4 possible users of the site. Those who are familiar with Percy Grainger's work and have a keen interest in finding out more, that's me. Those who are aware of Grainger but regard him perhaps negatively as a fringe figure or an object of mild curiosity. Slightly larger group, I would think. Those who've never heard of Grainger but who would recognise the tune Country Gardens and possibly other tunes, I think that's a still larger group. And then by far the largest group, those who've never heard of Grainger and have no recognition of him even when they hear some of his music. Now you could aim this site at any of those 4 groups, but the problem at the moment is that it's unclear which group you're aiming at, who's the target audience. And from an autistic perspective, there's really no reason to log into the site. So, the question is, what might be the hook here? What would be the thing that would bring an autistic person to this site? I could think of a couple of things that emerge when you look around the Grainger website. One is Grainger's own neurodivergence. I'm not going to say Grainger was autistic. I think retrospective diagnoses like that are probably risky. But it's pretty clear that he had a very unusual brain. And so there may be something we could do with that thought. And then the other one, a more musical thing, is the idea of making music from the objects in your home. This is one of the strongest aspects of the Gloss site as it stands, this idea of including sounds that wouldn't normally be considered musical. And I think that's something that you could run with in terms of giving a novice user or an autistic user some kind of way into this material. So the next work package was the analysis and development package. I have written quite a bit in the report about autistic needs. There is this formula, autism versus environment equals outcome, which is quite well known. Obviously, with this project, it's a web environment rather than a physical environment. But even so, we are asking people, particularly if they're using sounds from their home, to engage with their physical environment as well. So the implications of that need to be considered. Another important aspect is monotropism. Now, there isn't time to go into this theory in detail, but basically it describes the way an autistic brain works. The idea is that an autistic person tends to focus very deeply onto one thing at a time. So if you have a field of possibilities, this is very complex and can be overwhelming. And what the autistic brain tends to do is to find a hook, a way in to one particular aspect, and then focus in on that in great depth. This is monotropism. And what that leads to is a state of flow. And flow in music is well understood. Many musicians talk about times when they feel that they're not really having to think about playing their instrument. They're totally absorbed in what they're doing. They're in a state of flow. And this is regarded as musically very desirable. For autistic people, this is a common state, to be in a state of flow. So it's an easy state to access if you have the right triggers, even via the web. We need to consider sensitivities. Most autistic people are hypersensitive to certain things, smells, sounds, sights, and so on. But there is also the opposite, hyposensitivity, a lack of sensitivity. It's more unusual, but it does exist. And it's crucial that we have clear communication. I think that is the most important thing for autistic users, is that everything is communicated very clearly, however complex it may be. Complex ideas are not a problem. What is a problem is unclear communication. The language used needs to be affirming language, and I would include an insistence on identity first. That's to say, call a person an autistic person, not a person with autism, which is person first language. The reason for that is that autism is part of your identity. You're born with it, it doesn't change. It's not a disease, it's a different state of being. Stimming is something that non-autistic people tend not to know much about, but is important, and I think is very relevant to this site, actually. Stimming is repetitive movements. It can be things like, playing with your hair, fiddling with a fidget device, rocking backwards and forwards, flapping your hands, and so on. It looks quite strange if you're not autistic. If you are autistic, you understand it very well. It's a form of emotional regulation. But I think there's something you can do with the web that involves a stimming-like effect that can be quite attractive. And then also we need to bear in mind that quite a few of our users will be non-speaking and maybe using some kind of communication device in order to interact. And often these can be connected to the website, so we need to design with them in mind as well. I identified then some user profiles. I think there are three basic types. There are non-musicians who want to play with online sounds. Then there are average level musicians who just want to make some music online. And then thirdly, there are some advanced musicians who want to make music online or offline. And I also identify three sound types. The one-shots, which are individual samples, and that's what we have already in profusion on Gloss. Then there are loops. Now, these are very useful, particularly on the web. Short musical patterns that can be repeated over and over again. We do have a couple of examples of those in the Gloss, but I think generally speaking, there aren't many loops. And then finally, the VST instrument presets. These are complete sampled instruments with a wide variety of articulations and durations and so on. And those don't exist currently on the Gloss site, and they would be a great addition. So I thought I'd give you some examples of the kind of thing that could be done. I'm going to take these through in order of sophistication. So this would work for the user type 1. This is a guide to 100 musical instruments. What we have on screen are cartoon-like pictures of each instrument, organised alphabetically, with some basic information about them. And when you click on them, you hear the sound. So there it is, it's very simple, and you just choose the instrument you're interested in, click on it, and you hear the sound The simplicity is not a bad thing. I think that this is quite an attractive site, and I can imagine a lot of autistic users becoming quite interested in this. So there's a lot to be said for it, but it is very simple. The next demonstration is a site called Incredibox. Now this is basically a beatboxing site, you know, beatboxing where you make sounds with your mouth, and it uses animation and loops to create a very addictive experience. And I'll just demonstrate a bit of it. We could go on for hours with this, but basically, as you'll see, you click and drag to cue up a particular beatboxing sound. Here we go. Okay, I have to admit I've spent a lot of time playing with this site. This is just one of the songs on it, so there are many songs that you can unlock, and you can buy a subscription. There's a whole community making music with this toy, and it's great fun and it's very addictive. Okay, and then this is perhaps more aimed at the level 2 type user. So this is a sampler where you can use head movements to control the cueing of the samples. You can also do it with your keyboard and mouse, but the idea of this kind of interactivity would appeal, I think, to a lot of autistic people where perhaps motor control is not the best. So I've loaded up some of the samples from the Gloss site, and just to give you an idea here, let's play this. So I think this is beginning to get closer to probably what the intention was behind the Gloss site when it was assembled. And then finally, I just wanted to play you this. This is a promo demonstration of an online sampler. And, well, I'll just play it first and then say something about it. So this is one of many such tools that exist on the web. This is basically replicating the kind of thing you would have if you had a package such as Logic or Cubase, so a sequencer sampler package that you had on your own machine. And using this requires quite a high level of sophistication. And if you're going to use that, you will want VST instruments, and I mentioned this before. So it's an online digital audio workstation with VST, that's Virtual Studio Technology, instruments. Okay, so this is high-end user. This is someone with considerable expertise, so my level 3 user. All right, so that's the review, and I've started to come up with some initial development ideas. So for level 1, I thought that you could implement something a bit like what I did once before with Random Round. Sorry to cut that off in its full flow there. That was built in 2004 using Flash, and so it doesn't really work on any web browser these days. It shows its age. But I think you could do something perhaps a bit like Incredibox with that piece, Random Round, involving animations. For the level 2 user, I think what you would want is some loops and some one-shots. And I would make some kind of interactive interface that can be controlled, as we've seen, with body, head, hand movements. Grouping the sound into types that can be added to the interface, moved around and edited on the fly. And then crucially, you can save or share the results. And I think that's very important if we want to build a community around the site. It's the ability to share. And then for the level 3 user, the pro level, we would want full VST instruments, as I've already mentioned, a range of loops and articulations, some one-shots for sure, but also loops with the lights and furnishing sounds, possibly including some of the free music sounds. I think that would be great, and probably an educational component. So some kind of explanation of Grainger's approach to compositions and suggestions about how this could be expanded today. So thanks very much for listening, and of course I'll take any questions.